When you picture Antarctica, what comes to mind? Probably emptiness, right? Just a vast, frozen continent, peaceful and quiet. But what if that whole image is just a carefully maintained illusion? Today we're asking a pretty serious question. Is the world's last wilderness about to become its next global flashpoint? I mean, just look at this. On the surface, it's endless ice. But what you're really seeing here is a quiet convergence of national ambitions, all focused on the last big unclaimed piece of planet Earth. So the big question is, what happens when the ice, both the literal ice and the diplomatic ice, starts to melt? To really get a handle on all this tension, we've got to start with the official story, the one we're all told. Is Antarctica really the continent of peace that it's made out to be? For more than 60 years, the official line has been all about harmony. Antarctica is held up as a global commons, this amazing natural laboratory for all of humanity, where collaboration always trumps conflict. But, and you knew there was a but coming, that peaceful veneer is incredibly thin, because buried under all that ice is a continent full of untapped resources. And long before it was ever a symbol of peace, it was a prize that some of the world's most powerful nations had their eyes on for a very long time. So how in the world did we go from a potential land grab, a total free-for-all, to a continent dedicated to science? Well, it all comes down to this one remarkable treaty that essentially froze the entire conflict in place. Okay, so the foundation was laid way back in 1959 with the Antarctic Treaty. And this thing was a masterpiece of Cold War diplomacy. It just paused all territorial claims and completely demilitarized the entire continent. Brilliant. Then, over the decades, it got even stronger, with new agreements to protect seals, to protect marine life, and then the big one in 1991, the Madrid Protocol. That's what banned all mining and officially dedicated the continent to peace and science. Now, the core idea that made this all possible is called sovereign neutrality, and honestly, it's a brilliant diplomatic workaround. Instead of trying to solve the impossible problem of who owns what, the treaty just suspends the claims. It lets countries that fundamentally disagree on ownership still work right alongside each other. It was a genius way to just agree to disagree. But here's the thing. That genius solution, that really elegant compromise from the Cold War, well, it's starting to show its age. And we are starting to see some pretty serious cracks in the ice. And ironically, the very things that made the treaty work so well back then are now its greatest weaknesses. The language is vague on purpose. There's no real enforcement body, no police. Getting anything done requires every single one of the 29 voting countries to agree, which is nearly impossible. And inspections, they're completely voluntary. The whole system is built on trust, in an era where trust is in pretty short supply. This brings us to the core dilemma. Is the treaty still a workable compromise, or is it, as one legal expert, Gillian Triggs, called it, a purgatory of ambiguity? I love that phrase. It's this giant gray area that's so vast that nations can bend the rules without ever technically breaking them. And all of this ambiguity has set the stage for what a lot of people are now calling a new great game on the ice. And yeah, there are some pretty clear opposing teams. So on one side, you have the preservationists. We're talking countries like Australia and France. Their main goal is to strengthen the treaty, create huge marine protected areas, and really lock in the continent's environmental protections for good. Then on the other side, you've got the positioning powers, like China and Russia. They're looking at Antarctica through a much more strategic lens. They're positioning themselves for a future where resources might be up for grabs, establishing tech that could be used for science or military purposes, and using their presence there as a lever in global politics. So what happens when these two competing visions collide? What does it actually look like when the rules start to bend and then finally break? Well, to figure that out, researchers at the Rand Corporation ran this fascinating tabletop exercise. It was essentially a war game for the future of an entire continent. They simulated how different countries might act as the whole system starts coming under stress. And the game revealed two really clear paths to failure. The first is a kind of death by 1,000 cuts, where countries just keep bending the rules, exploiting those ambiguities we talked about, until the treaty becomes basically meaningless. The second path is a sudden death scenario, where some big crisis, like, say, a new space race using Antarctica as a training ground, just shatters the treaty's core principles all at once. And you can see exactly how this would play out. In the simulation, the team playing as France made a classic preservationist move. They doubled down on environmental protection, pushing for those marine parks, trying to block any hint of resource exploitation. They were playing defense for the status quo. Meanwhile, the team playing Russia went on offense. Their move was a direct challenge. They basically said, hey, as these resources become easier to get, we intend to get them, with or without the treaty's permission. And that right there is the whole conflict in a nutshell. One side trying to reinforce the rules, the other getting ready to throw them away. So all this brings us to the final and most critical question. What does this mean for the future of the ice? And what does it mean for the rest of us? The worst-case scenario is what the report calls a race to the bottom. Once one major power decides the rules don't apply anymore, others might feel forced to follow suit. And that could lead to a chaotic free-for-all, a scramble for resources and territory that destroys the environment and shatters decades of peace. And this is really why this all matters, even if you never plan to visit the South Pole. What happens in Antarctica won't stay in Antarctica. It could be a preview, a harbinger of how we're going to manage all the other shared spaces that belong to everyone and no one. Ultimately, you have to ask, if we can't uphold a 60-year-old peace treaty in this remote, frozen desert, how can we possibly expect to govern our other shared frontiers? If the rules for Antarctica melt away, what's next? The deep sea? Outer space? It's a question that really does affect us all.